Welcome, everybody. I am Tim Jacobson, CEO of NOxy Health Products, and I'm joined today with Dr. Andrea Pusic and Dr. Ann Klassen, the creators of the WoundQ Questionnaire. So welcome.
Thanks, Tim.
Our goal today is to help shine a light on the marvel and the success that is the WoundQ Questionnaire. And so we want to talk through what that is, where it came from, and how it can really help industry, patients, and clinicians serve their patients who are suffering through chronic wounds in a more focused way. So maybe let's start with talking about what is the impetus, the genesis of the WoundQ Questionnaire.
Thanks, Tim. Maybe Ann, I'll start us off. Ann and our team has developed a number of patient-reported outcome measures, which we can talk a little more about. But we were visiting the FDA because they had interest in other scales that we had developed. One of the things that's always been great over the years is having a really good relationship with FDA and getting their feedback on our measures. And while we're taking questions, someone raised their hand and said, we have a problem here, and we'd love your thoughts on it. And what they talked about was about chronic wounds, which was not what we were talking about. But they had been seeing a number of really great applications for treatments that showed great promise that might be able to improve quality of life for patients with chronic wounds, improve physical function, decrease smell, and allow people to decrease pain. And yet, because the primary endpoint for success as a treatment for chronic wounds was reepithelialization or closure of the wound, they were feeling that they couldn't actually identify and measure the benefit of these potential treatments, which may not necessarily close the wound, but we're showing evidence of perhaps improving a patient's quality of life. And so I give the FDA lots of credit on that one, that they recognized that there was a need and there was actual innovation happening in this space, but that the existing measures weren't capturing that. And that was leaving them in a position that they weren't able to, I think, to be able to move forward with some of these great new products and treatments. So it was really them asking us to think about working in this space. And that was really, we took it from there. We formed a great stakeholder group that included the FDA and patients and investigators. And from there, the WoundQ was born.
That's excellent. And Dr. Klassen, maybe you can share, what is the WoundQ Questionnaire for those that may not have any familiarity with it? What is it, and what's its purpose?
It was very collaborative. Just to say, so what is a WoundQ? Like, we brought together people from a number of countries to develop this. And the WoundQ, then, what it is it really is, it's a patient-reported outcome measure that measures concepts that are important to patients. So with chronic wounds, and how do we know that? So this international collaboration, we got together and then we did this series of very in-depth qualitative interviews with 60 patients from 4 countries to really learn what's it like to live with a chronic wound. And I'll just say, from my own perspective, I didn't really know anything about chronic wounds. I've never had one. No one in my family has. But jumping in and doing this qualitative research as someone who's, like, my background is I'm a PhD, so I'm not a medical person. So, and then hearing their stories, these 60 really in-depth stories that are all kind of audio recorded and transcribed and then translated into English for the Danish and Dutch ones. And then going through this process of kind of trying to figure out what are the main things that matter to patients, and then taking that. And so what the WoundQ is it's a series of independently functioning scales that measure the concepts that came out as being the most important to patients. And so what we do is we really talk to them in detail and then use their own words to create the content for the WoundQ to measure these things that came up as really important to them. So covering those issues that are very troubling for them, living with a chronic wound that's not going away or not healing. It really has an impact on, their psychosocial well-being and their social life and their sleep. So these are the things that, came up as being really important. And it's also about their experience of healthcare, because they are treated by different people, like there would be home healthcare people coming in and looking after the wound, or they go into the hospital. So we have a series of, we call them scales, that measure their experience of healthcare, because that's really important too for improving quality and to really understand, how they're feeling about how they're treated by different healthcare providers, and do they have enough and the right information for looking after their wounds as well. So it's got these independently functioning scales. Some people will say, oh, it's too long, for example, but in fact, it's like you would, if you were wanting to use the WoundQ in, say, a research study or even in clinical care, you would look at what it measures and then pick out the different aspects of it that you need. So you wouldn't necessarily use all the scales, but you'd use the ones that were the most appropriate based on, if it's a research study or in clinical care. And so as a patient-reported outcome, really what it is it measures from the patient's perspective. So it's incorporating the patient voice into the assessment of outcomes rather than relying just on objective measures. Is that wound closing, like what Andrea was talking about earlier? Is that wound closing? But it's really about these other issues, because maybe the wound never closes, but these other issues are very important to patients. And so it measures these things from the patient's perspective.
Anne's touched on a number of really important things, but I think, and one of it is the uses of the WoundQ. So I'm a plastic surgeon, I'm a clinician, and very much the WoundQ was designed also to measure the impact of treatment and clinical care. So, I might look at a wound and say it's getting smaller or it's getting bigger, but it's only the patient who knows how much pain they're having, or how the wound is impacting their family life or their social life or their physical function. So I can only know by asking the patient and asking in a structured way that provides meaningful measurement. So clinical care is one. We touched a little bit on research, because I really feel that the WoundQ is going to help us innovate and understand the impact of our innovation, so that we understand that we have a new treatment. Is it really working from a patient's perspective? So that's a key piece. And then I think also from a quality and regulatory perspective. So those are kind of in terms of, to your question about how the WoundQ, what are the different uses for the WoundQ? I think, as we've talked about the idea of the 60 patients that we interviewed qualitatively, that was so important to understand the lived experience of patients. And then to take what we developed, to take it back to them and say, did we miss anything? Does this resonate with you? Is it easy to understand? And I, like Anne, I'm a surgeon and I dealt with chronic wounds, but I didn't appreciate until we read those transcripts, the suffering of the impact of chronic wounds on patients' lives. It's mind blowing, really. And patients will suffer it's kind of an isolating condition as well. And it's a very private condition. So people, you see a person with if you see someone with an amputation, you go, oh, that's what that is. Someone with a chronic wound, it's a hidden suffering. And I think that was of all the measures we developed, that was the one that was, I think, most troubling to me in terms of sort of seeing that this is the impact of chronic wounds. But it also is one of the reasons that I think we find the WoundQ the most rewarding measure that we've developed, because of the potential impact it has to change this field and be able to understand the patient perspective. As we talked a little bit about measurement, maybe Anne will comment a bit more about this too. The other key piece of this, though, is we took this subjective lived experience, the qualitative work, talking to patients, but then a big part of developing a patient-reported outcome measure is to transform that into rigorous measurement, to take it so that the WoundQ is a highly reliable, accurate, responsive measurement tool, the same way we use other measurement tools and all the other things we do. So as a clinician or as a researcher. So that's, I think, a really key point. And the way we did that was to then take the scales that we developed based on lots of qualitative input, and then administer those questions to a large sample. And Anne can speak to that, about a large sample of patients. And then we were able to then work out essentially the math, psychometrics of it, and refine the scales and the scoring algorithms. So there's a whole other second piece of work that comes into it, which is the turning this into really a highly rigorous, refined measurement tool.
Great. Well, I think you've touched on two really important topics, and I want to dig deeper into both of those. One is what you talked about was this patient experience, that it really struck you just how much these patients were suffering. A couple of years ago, the FDA held a town hall meeting where they brought in patient after patient after patient, and they told their story. And for me, we're developing a product for this market. I thought I understood the market very well, I was really taken aback, as you said, Dr. Pusic, at how much these patients truly suffer. As you went through these patient interviews and as you were putting this together, what really stood out to you about the patient condition?
I think for me, the main theme that really rose up from the data when I was, because I went through a lot of these transcripts, and I'm the person who kind of put together the first draft of the WoundQ that then the team kind of worked with. But it was frustration and irritation. That really was a strong theme, like that the frustration with their wound and the impact that it was having on their life. And I think when you develop these prompts, you really do see differences, because we've developed quite a few prompts, and you see differences between different patient populations based on their condition. And so that was something that really kind of came up out of the interviews from my perspective. And I just, this one story pops into my head from one of the patients that we interviewed. So what we tend to do is we tend to do our qualitative work, and then you come up with the first draft, and then you bring it back to the patients. We like to use the same people as much as we can, because then they're invested and they actually really appreciate. And then we can say, did we capture your experience? Like, does this prompt reflect what you told us? And so this one man who had been part of the interview, and then we showed him the scales. And I remember him saying, it actually brings a tear to my eye because you guys get it. And even my family doesn't really understand. So I think there's this kind of sense of people don't really understand what they go through, because they're living it and other people aren't. But they said, like he was saying to us, that, yeah, you captured it. You captured my experience. And that's what you want to hear, is that actually we were able to translate the qualitative work into something that actually resonates with patients and captures their experience.
I'll add one more into that, because I think that I completely agree with you, Anne, on that. I think the other one is that sense of isolation. So going on, so frustration, but also isolation. And that's partly why the work is satisfying in terms of this, is that so when we were also, at a certain point, the WoundQ was being rolled out through a large quality initiative in Australia. And as part of that, they took the WoundQ scales and showed it to Australian patients and families to make sure that this was a big funded national effort. They wanted to make sure they were picking the right measure. And so they sent us back some of the quotes from patients. And one, again, was a wife who was reviewing this with her husband. And the quote was, I won't get it exactly, but it was basically that we had the nicest conversation that we'd had in the 40 years that he'd had with his wound. It opened something up, and we were able to talk about it. And when you think about, like, when in the quotes, that the 40 years that he had had this wound, it opened something up that we could talk about, and it was a thank you. It's like, so it would, and I thought, God, people, they live for 40 years, and even your wife is you're isolated from her. And then, but the idea then also is that some of these treatments that don't close the wound, that we're not going to fix that wound necessarily after 40 years, but if it could decrease social isolation, if it could improve quality of life in terms of physical function and decrease pain, I think that's really where we need to be going. And that was the thing that has made the work around the WoundQ very rewarding.
Good. I can just imagine how touching many of those experiences were. What a wonderful contribution to the field and to these patients' lives. I also wanted to talk about the process of validating the scales and getting the work published. Maybe you want to touch on that process a little bit.
Well, one of the greatest things is doing these projects collaboratively and working with really great people in different countries and working with young people and helping to incorporate and train and mentor different, trainee plastic surgeons and that kind of thing around the world. So the validation part, so the qualitative part is a lot of work. That's the first part. And it's the most important. And we've already talked quite a bit about the qualitative, but it really is the most important, because if you don't get that part right, then it doesn't matter down the road if you collect data from, 1,000 people and show that, it somehow works psychometrically, has a, high reliability. But it's missing the mark because it's not measuring the most important things. So that qualitative is really important. And then what we did is we do a large quantitative portion where what we had is in the 4 countries, we had to get it translated into Danish and Dutch. And then in the 4 countries, so Canada, US, Denmark, the Netherlands, we recruited, and it was over 800 patients. And these were hospital-based patients that were getting treatment in one clinics. And they filled it out. And we're so grateful because it's always really long. They have to fill out everything. We were saying earlier that you can pick and choose and use only the ones that are most appropriate. But the field test, really, everyone fills out as much as is relevant to them. And then we analyze that data and we shorten the scales. And actually, 3 of the scales that we developed didn't really work and hang together psychometrically. So those were dropped and we ended up with the 13. And we're looking to see, do the scales, do the items work, and trimming off items that don't really work? Because what we're trying to do for each scale is develop something that works like a ruler. So it's measuring a concept, say like social function, and the items map out and they get kind of harder as you answer down the scale, so that we've got this score at the end of the day that is very meaningful and we can measure change. So it's really, this is the advantage of the modern psychometric approach, that you can come up with these really rigorous scales, something that used to be thought to be quite subjective. And they are subjective concepts, but that they can be measured rigorously. And then you're looking to see, is there evidence that these scales function as you would hypothesize they should? So people that have a wound that, say, causes odor, but, like, are the scores different for people that say it's just a little bit of a smell too? Like, it's so bad that everyone around me can smell it. Does our scale measure that in a way that you would expect it to?
So when we say a scale, that's a series of questions that assess one single idea, one thing. So Anne's saying smell, so I'll say smell. But it could be social isolation. So a scale is a series of questions, and we use the word item, we mean a question. So it's just that in terms of the for clarity on that. But I think that's exactly it. But the concept that this is rigorous measurement now, that's where modern psychometrics has really got us to the point, and that's why PROMs are really changing the way how we function in healthcare in terms of how we are able to be truly patient-centered, because we have, and it's not just our measurement tool, but patient-reported outcome measurement overall, I think, is really changing healthcare. The ability to access and reliably, rigorously measure the patient's perspective is critical to the success of treatment. I don't want to do things that's just so that I, the doctor, think it got better. I want my patient to be able to tell me that they got better.
That's what I really love about the questionnaire, is because it does allow the patient, as you said earlier, Dr. Pusic, it brings the patient voice into the goals of care. And let's actually go there now. Let's talk about in the clinic. A patient comes into the clinic and a doctor has the questionnaire. How might the doctor use that questionnaire with the patient? And is that one of the main goals of the questionnaire?
Absolutely. So using the WoundQ in clinical care is absolutely one of the central reasons we developed the WoundQ, full stop. And as Anne has said, if as a clinician, say, if you were setting up if you have a wound care center, you would look at the entirety of the WoundQ and you'd say, we're going to use these 4 scales in all our patients, or we're going to use these 3 scales in patients like this, and we're going to use these scales in patients like that. The idea is to not be burdensome to patients, but to be very targeted about what it is that what their complaints are. I think you could also, in getting to your point, Tim, about sort of goals of care, chronic wounds are there's a lot of heterogeneity, a lot of variety, right? And also patient goals are different. And so it could be that a patient specifically, their target goals, the pain, we need to decrease the pain. That's the thing that I need to be able to sleep at night. That's one. Another patient may not have a lot of pain, but again, smell may be a problem, or wound drainage might be a problem, right? So I think also there's the ability to really personalize the measurement and then personalize the treatments to really be able to achieve those patients' goals. And I think that's central to it. And thinking again about the chronicity, to just be able to say, we're going to get your wound closed, ma'am, it doesn't cut it. It really doesn't. And patients understand that, but I think clinicians understand that. But now we're able to apply measurement to that, to be able to really track these other outcomes, but I think getting at the idea that it's patients could identify what matters most to them. And then in terms of clinical care, the idea too that you could measure every time the same way, like you might be measuring the size of the wound. Now you measure the pain that the wound is causing, or that, the social impact of the wound. It's that repeat rigorous measurement that we use in every other aspect of healthcare and in the management of chronic wounds. But now it's a patient-centered measure. So that's really how it be used. You pick and choose the scales. The patient could be involved in the picking and choosing of which scales they would want to be measured repeatedly. And then you can track that longitudinally. There's also, I think, the opportunity to be able to think about how, in the context of wound care centers and clinical care, about benchmarking and using this for quality assessment. So it's, again, it's the individual, but also the aggregate data will also be useful in terms of understanding the performance of a wound care team or a variety of wound care centers and how they may perform differently one relative to the other.
Terrific. So full disclosure, we are developing a product. We're taking it through the FDA process. We're currently in a clinical trial, and we currently are using the WoundQ questionnaire. So we are using 3 of the 13. And so it's very exciting for us to be one of the first sponsors to be using the questionnaire. So let's now shift and talk a little bit about how is it that industry can use the questionnaire in product development? How might they architect it into a protocol? How might they use it in their conversations with the FDA for approval?
I guess I'd start with from an FDA perspective. I'm not speaking as the FDA, I'm speaking out of respect for the different individuals that I have worked with over the years. And I will say I have repeatedly been struck by how they want to see science advance. They want to see great products get to the market, and they want to see us providing great patient care. And so I really feel that they've actually been great partners in guiding our work. The FDA also did some great work. I don't know what year that was published in, but they've at different times have really set a bar in terms of how patient-reported outcome measures can and should be developed in a way that is patient-centered, really has high content validity, meaning that you did all that qualitative work to figure out that you're measuring the right thing, and then is rigorously psychometrically tested. That's the catch-all term is validation, but there's more to it. So all to say is that I think we have followed their guidance and then some. Anne and I believe, just wholeheartedly, I think you can pick up on the importance of rigorous measurement. That otherwise, it's what's the point, right? And so, in terms of guidance for industry, I think to be able to share with the FDA, I mean, FDA actually is aware of sort of all the work that's gone into the WoundQ, to know that the measurement tool is fit for purpose for the indication that you're looking at. That I think is understanding the rigor of the tool, but then also understanding the application. So figuring out what it is, and very practically, what is it your product is going to do? What's the target patient population, and what is it that you would hypothesize that your product could accomplish? So again, I'll go back to the example of maybe it decreases pain, or maybe it decreases drainage. Then you would want to pick scales that measure that to understand the impact of the treatment from the patient perspective. I will say also that I think it's also important to get the global assessment of a patient. So understanding not just the wound, but the impact, say social impact would be an example, something that helps understand the greater, because I do think FDA quite rightly is also interested in that, because people are not their wound. they have lives that their wound is impacting. So I think that's, without being too prescriptive about it, but I think it's about understanding that this is a measurement tool that is developed in alignment with what the FDA has recommended, and we're full support of that, and really grateful for the guidance that they provided to the entire quality of life research community over the years. I think that's been a great partnership. And then the idea that when you're actually looking for your own study, I would really think hard about what it is that you think the product might be able to do, and then look at the 13 scales and read the questions, because it's also kind of getting at, go beyond the name of the scale, but look at the questions and say, do I think that a patient receiving our treatment would answer before the treatment, or different intervals, would we anticipate an improvement across these kinds of questions? Because that's really targeting it to the anticipated impact of your intervention.
Terrific. Let's wrap it up with a final question. So a couple of years ago, the data was that there was 8.5 million people in the United States that suffered from a chronic wound. And now there's 10.5 million people that suffer from a chronic wound. If you look at the 5-year mortality rate of patients with chronic wounds, it's 5 times higher than the 5-year mortality rate for breast cancer. It's 13 times higher than patients with prostate cancer. In the very beginning of this conversation, we talked about how this is a silent epidemic, that these patients are dealing with this condition in an isolated, lonely, and oftentimes painful, both physically and psychologically. They're dealing with that in this way. At NOxy, our mission is to be a part of the solution, a part of the puzzle, one piece to the puzzle to end the chronic wound epidemic. That's something that we talk about as our mission. That is our goal. I want to know from you all, how can the WoundQ questionnaire be a part of this great ambition to end the chronic wound epidemic? Where do you see it fitting in the long term?
That's a good question. I'm just going to say that, I think by inclusion in clinical trials, and I think about that FDA meeting that was 2 years ago. Andrea and I were invited to speak about the WoundQ, which was a great honor. And I listened in to the patients, and the patients were saying, help us. They, there's not enough research happening for chronic wound patients to identify, things that will help. So I think that it's the time is now, and we've got a great instrument, and I think it can be, if it's incorporated into clinical trials, to try to help to find treatments that work. That's what needs to happen.
Yeah, I would agree 100% with that. And I would add also in clinical care, I think that there is the other way that we're going to be able to help patients is to improve the individual care of every patient we see. And the only way, we can only improve what we're measuring. And so if we're measuring things that matter a lot to patients, and rigorously measuring it. So I would encourage clinicians to also consider using the WoundQ in routine clinical care. And also wound care collaboratives. We've had some great experiences and support from national wound care collaboratives. And I think that getting the word out, but also then being able to sort of understand as a learning community, being able to understand the real world evidence to support such and such a treatment or something different. So I think also there's an opportunity beyond clinical trials to be able to understand and improve care for the individual patient, but use our aggregate data as well to be able to understand and advance the field.
When we develop these prompts, there are also dynamic things that because of the way it's developed with the new psychometric approach and independently functioning scales, we have the opportunity to add new ones as new concepts are identified. And that's something that is also important. So we, just where WoundQ is going, we have actually added 3 new scales to the WoundQ to measure one of the topics that you brought up is the financial impact, but also for leg wounds, function and symptoms that are specific to the impact of having wounds anywhere on the leg. So it is possible to do that, which is a really great thing. And so, just keep watching the space too to see what happens over time with the WoundQ.
Wonderful. But I just want to thank both of you, not just for being here today, but I want to thank you for doing your best in the 3rd grade, doing your best in high school, doing your best in your graduate work.
You don't know that.
so that you could be prepared for this contribution. I personally feel the emotion of the WoundQ questionnaire and what it can mean for patients down the road. And I just on behalf of all of them, I just want to say thank you for preparing yourselves for this moment to make this contribution. So thank you.
Thanks, Tim. That's very kind of you. Really, we appreciate that very much. And thank you for what you're doing.
Yes.
These are the great partnerships and collaborations. Thank you for that. It's kindness.
Well, we hope that this interview makes it out to clinicians. We hope it makes it out to industry. We hope people become educated about the WoundQ questionnaire. If they want to know more information, where can they go?
They should go to our website, click on WoundQ. So it's www.qportfolio.org. And then there's an email there. They can contact us. And we've got a great person that works with us and answers our emails and passes on questions. So that's how best to contact.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Pusic, Dr. Klassen. We appreciate your time.